Hello class, this is Cold War Part 1 Quiz Study Guide. The quiz is this Friday on November 30th, 2018. This will be a short study guide and very to the point, so there's only going to be 9 slides, so just please study those very carefully. Alright, so we talked in class that the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union were the two superpowers after World War II. So Europe's destroyed. Everywhere else, the United States didn't lose as many men. They still had a lot of money. They didn't have any of their land destroyed. The Soviet Union, while not as strong, were still in good shape. Their infrastructure, their roads, their buildings, all that was in good, even though they lost a lot of men. They were stronger than any country around them. They're going to compete. They both competed for influence around the world. It's called a Cold War because they never fired shots at each other, but they competed in other areas. So you have U.S. and capitalism. The U.S. believed in democracy, freedom, and capitalism. A democracy means you get a choice. People get a choice in government. People get to vote on laws, get to vote on people to lead them. Freedom, they had the freedom of the press, freedom of speech. You got to choose where to work, what job to get. You got to choose and be free in a lot of your choices. They also believed in capitalism, and we talked about how capitalism is an economic system where businesses and people choose what to produce and what to buy. You as the consumer get to choose, okay, do I want to buy these Nike? Do I want to play Fortnite and buy the skins? Whatever it is that you get to choose, you have a say in it. And you can choose to not buy stuff, and if ever a bunch of people choose not to buy stuff, that company will go out of business or they got to change. So that's the U.S. and capitalism. Now the USSR, I use USSR, Soviet Union, Russia, they're all three mean the same. But they believed in dictatorships, limiting freedoms, and communism. A dictatorship means you have one person, a dictator, in charge. It's controlled by one person, and people like regular citizens like me and you had no input. We could not tell them, hey, we do this, or hey, we think this is good. They did not listen. The guy named Joseph Stalin, the dictator, controlled everything. They had limited freedoms. The government chose where you would work, live, and limited your speech, what you could watch, and what you could read. So like we talked about how that they could cut out some of the social media if you were living in a communist country today, but they cut out newspapers and radio, and they pretty much told you what to do and where to work. Now, as far as the economic system, they believed in communism. This is a system where the government makes decisions on what and how much to produce. So in this economic system, there was no rich and poor people. Everybody would get paid the same, and they told you where to work, and then they told your factory, if you worked in a washing machine factory, they told you how many washing machines to produce. So if your company, they had more washing machines, you do have a good year, but if you had less washing machines to produce, you'd have a bad year. But it really didn't matter to you because you got paid the same in communism. And we talked about how people could be doctors in capitalism and make a lot of money. In communism, you might be a doctor, but you're not going to make, and you're going to make similar money to everybody else. The very first battle of the Cold War, Germany was split up after World War II. Remember, Berlin, its capital, was as well. So Berlin and Germany are split up. Then you have France, Great Britain, and the U.S. controlled the west part of Germany and the west part of Berlin, and the USSR and Soviet Union controlled the east. In an attempt to make Berlin communist, the Soviet Union created a blockade and blocked supplies, food, and water from coming into West Berlin. And so they kind of blocked, and there was the picture I showed you on our PowerPoint was the Russian bear encircling and put his arms around Berlin, but they created this blockade, and they were hoping that if they blocked all their supplies, food, and water, that eventually they'd have to surrender and say, okay, we'll be communists. But in an attempt to avoid all-out war and still prevent Berlin from becoming completely communist, the U.S. and its allies decided to fly supplies into West Berlin. This succeeded in less than a year the blockade was over. This is called the Berlin Airlift. At its height in the Berlin Airlift, a plane took off and landed every 30 seconds during the Berlin Airlift. There were over 300,000 flights in and out of West Berlin in a year. The U.S. and its allies won the first battle of the Cold War. Shortly after this, NATO, that's NATO, NATO was established. They would do that in an attempt to protect itself and other countries from becoming communist. The U.S. and its allies formed NATO, and NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All of these countries border the Northern Atlantic Ocean. Its main purpose was to set up an alliance of nations willing to defend each other should it be necessary. And so the plan of the U.S. and its allies was containment. The U.S. knew it could not completely get rid of communism. It decided to try to contain it where it was and kind of like put it in a cage and just say, stay where you're at. Two wars were fought to stop the spread of communism. When North Korea tried to invade South Korea, the U.S. helped South Korea and prevented communism from spreading. We read about that today on Wednesday. A similar war was fought in Vietnam. However, it was not as successful, and Vietnam is still communist. It's not capitalist anymore, or it was never capitalist, but it was still communist. These are examples of proxy wars. The U.S. and Russia were just using others to fight their battles. So they didn't really fight head to head. That's why it's still called a Cold War, but they used other people to fight their battles. Next, the space race. They competed in the space race, like the Berlin Airlift, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. The U.S. and the Soviet Union will compete in space. Russia won the first battle and started the space race by putting Sputnik. Sputnik was a satellite, and they put it into orbit. It's the first man-made thing to go into orbit. That means it went around the Earth. They followed that up with putting a man in space. His name is Yuri Gagarin. He was the first man to ever go into space. And while at the very beginning of the space race, that looked very bleak, it looked very bad for the United States. But they're actually going to push in the 1950s, they're going to push math and science in schools, and that's going to push, and eventually they're going to create NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And this is where the United States is going to gain the momentum. They then gained the momentum by having John Glenn. We saw that in Hidden Figures. He orbited the Earth. They had Apollo 8 orbit the moon, and ultimately they had Apollo 11 land on the moon. So that's just a very quick summary of the Cold War and your study guide. Look over that. You'll have 10 questions on your quiz on Friday. And if you have any questions, please let me know.